Welcome. Welcome to this month's Exploring Quality in Family Childcare. Today we are talking about a subject that is very unique and special to family childcare in particular, mixed age play. I am very happy to introduce Dr. Peter Gray, a research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College, who has spent many years studying and writing about the value of play for children's development. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be speaking about mixed age play, which is really my favorite topic. Some of my first research into play was about the value of mixed age play. So as Grace said, there is a handout, which I think you all have, whether you've got it printed out or online. It would be useful if you've got it available to follow along as I talk. Not absolutely essential by any means, but I'll be referring to it as I go along. The handout is just one page, and it gives you an outline of the main points that I'll be making in this talk. And it also gives references to some of the studies that I will be referring to that have to do with age mixed play. So if you're looking at the handout, the first at A on the handout to begin with, that in which I state that age segregation is an artifact of modern times. So age segregated play, where children are just playing with other children who are within a year or two of their same age, from a historical and biological point of view, that's abnormal. That's not normal play. Throughout human history, children were never segregated by age. They always played in age mixed groups until relatively recent times. Certainly from a biological and historical perspective, we're talking about recent times. It's only been about 100 years that we have had age segregated schooling, where children are segregated by age at school. And because they're segregated by age in school, we began to think that children's natural playmates are the kids of the same school class as them. So recesses are same age kids playing together. And because they go to school with kids of the same age, they make friends with kids of the same age and so on. So we're kind of used to the idea that children play just with kids of the same age in recent times. My my argument in this presentation is that of course that's better than no play at all, way better than no play at all, but it's not as good as play when children are of mixed age, where children are playing with younger and older children freely in their own ways of playing. So when I say that age segregation I want to change this view again, so I'm seeing the gallery. There we go. So when I say that age mixed play is is an artifact of modern times, let me give some let me explain that a little bit further. Anthropologists who have observed children throughout the world say that in all those parts of the world where children are free to play in a non-school setting, most play is age mixed. Kids are playing with a wide range of ages. A few years ago, I got interested in hunter-gatherer cultures. There are still some, at least into the middle to late 20th century, it was still possible for anthropologists to trek out into kind of uncharted areas of Africa and Asia and South America and make contact with people who were still living in the ways that people lived prior to the development of agriculture. And I was interested in how children played in those cultures. And what I found out from that survey of anthropologists is that in every one of these groups that anthropologists had studied, children played essentially all day long. Children from about age 4, which is the age at which most hunter-gatherer adults believe that children have enough common sense that they don't have to be watched by adults all the time. from age 4 on into the mid-teenage years, children are off and away from adults, playing together in these age mixed groups. The older kids tend to be looking out for the younger kids. It helps make it safe for the younger kids. And what I learned from the anthropologists, and indirectly then from the hunter-gatherers themselves, is that they believe that this is how children learn. Children learn by playing, and they especially learn when they're playing in age mixed groups because the younger kids are always learning from the older kids. The older kids are really much more the teachers in those cultures than adults are because the older kids are just a little bit more advanced. And as they're playing together, the older kids are showing the younger ones how to do the things that they're playing at. And they tend to play at the things that are important to the culture. So, for example, in a culture which hunts with bows and arrows, they're playing with bows and arrows, and the older kids are helping the younger kids do this. And of course, the younger kids always really want to emulate the older kids. They want to be able to do the things that the older kids can do. So, but we don't have to go back to pre-agricultural times. When I was a kid, and part of my childhood, by the way, I lived in Wisconsin, in the town of Sun Prairie, which is very different now than it was then. But when I was a kid, in Sun Prairie and other towns that I lived in, we spent most of our time, truly most of our waking time, outdoors playing, especially certainly in the summer we did, but even during the school year, after school, during on weekends, we were largely outdoors playing. And we played with whatever the other kids were out there. And so it was certainly not just kids who were in our same grade at school. We were playing across ages. And so I have a lot of personal memories about the value of mixed age play. It was very common, and it is still common in those parts of the world where there's a lot of neighborhood play. You play with whatever kids live in your neighborhood, regardless of age. Your best friends might be very close to you in age. Your most common playmates might be close to you in age. But, I remember, for example, we'd get up a game of baseball. Well, baseball in those days, you went out to the vacant lot and there were a bunch of other kids who came out to the vacant lot and you'd make up your own game. There'd be no adults involved. And there might be kids there ranging from about 5 years old to teenagers. And so you'd have this interesting challenge of how do you balance the teams? How do you pitch differently to the little kids compared to the teenagers? And of course, the little kids were learning a lot about baseball, but also a lot about other things from the older kids. What's fair and not fair? How to make an argument about what you want. So this kind of age mixing was very, very common not that long ago, even in Wisconsin. So the place where I initially did my research on age mixed play, once I became a professor and a researcher and got interested in play, was at a remarkable school called the Sudbury Valley School. That's in Massachusetts, where I live, not far from where I live. And I got interested in this school largely because my son became a student there. And I had been doing a different kind of research, but when my son became a student at this very, very different, very alternative school, I got interested in various aspects of what happens at the school, partly as a concerned father, but ultimately as a researcher. And this is a school that where the educational philosophy is very similar to that of a hunter-gatherer band. The belief is that if children have lots of opportunities to learn, and there are people over the whole age range available, and the kids have a lot of free time to play and explore and do interesting things, they will educate themselves through their interactions with one another. This school was actually founded in 1968. It's still going. It's got hundreds of graduates at this point, and I have done studies of the graduates that show they're doing very well out in the world. It's in many ways, it doesn't look like a school at all. There's no imposed curriculum, there are no tests, and yet the children are learning. Now, I'm not gonna talk about so much about how they're learning, except I just want to point out that this was the context where I was able to observe mixed age play. The founder of the school always claimed that he died a couple of years ago, but he was involved with the school for over 50 years. He always claimed that a school like this would never work if the children were segregated by age, because he says it works because the children mix freely in age and the children are always learning from kids of a different age than them. And the younger kids are learning advanced skills, advanced ways of thinking because of their interactions with older kids. And the older kids are learning things that are every bit as important, like how to be caring and nurturing, how to teach, how to be a leader through their interactions with younger kids. And so I conducted studies there, observational studies, along with one of my graduate students, of what actually happens when children of different ages are playing together or interacting in other ways together. One of the things we observed is that when children are not playing, when they're just having conversation, they or working on some serious project, they tend to prefer to interact with others who are the same age as them, roughly the same age, within 2 or 3 years of the same age. But when they're playing, they actually seem to prefer to play across ages. The older kids love to play with little kids, so the little kids love to play with older kids. And often you'll have groups of kids playing together that span the entire age range from age 4, which is the youngest children in the at this school, on all the way to the teenage years. Very similar to the kind of play groups that you see in a hunter-gatherer band. So those are the contexts in which I've been interested in mixed age play. So now what I want to do here is go on to talk about how age mixing benefits first the younger children, that's B on your handout, and then how age mixing benefits the older children in an age mixed interaction. So the most obvious benefit to younger children in an age mixed interaction is that it allows children to do things that they wouldn't be able to do if they were just interacting with kids of the same age. Let me just illustrate this with an example. Suppose you had in your daycare center or preschool or whatever it is, only 4-year-olds. All you had was 4-year-olds. Think of the things that would not be possible for those 4-year-olds to do. So, for example, they couldn't have a simple game of catch, throwing a ball to one another and catching it and throwing it back and forth, because no 4-year-old can throw the ball straight enough for the another 4-year-old to catch it. And no 4-year-old can catch the wild throw of another 4-year-old. So they might try to have a game of catch, but it soon very quickly fall apart. I'm taking catch as just an example. It's kind of a metaphor for all of the things that 4-year-olds wouldn't be able to do with one another if there were only 4-year-olds there. But now let's put an 8-year-old in the picture. An 8-year-old and a 4-year-old can have a good game of catch, and I've seen this over and over. The 8-year-old can toss the ball gently into the hands of the 4-year-old so the 4-year-old can actually catch it. And the 8-year-old feels good about doing this. This is also a skill. I can toss the ball gently and straight enough for this 4-year-old to catch it. And the 8-year-old can run and leap and jump and catch the wild throw of the 4-year-old. So they can have a very interesting game of catch where both of them are being challenged in their skills. And it's fun for both of them. It's not that the 8-year-old is sacrificing anything to be helpful to the 4-year-old. The 8-year-old is having every bit as much fun as the 4-year-old is in this game of catch. We've seen all kinds of physical games and activities where what the older child does is to enable the younger child to do something that the younger child would not be able to do if the younger child were only with other kids of the same age and the same ability. So what I'm talking about here is something that the developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, a famous Russian developmental psychologist of the 1930s, who coined the term zone of proximal development. Vygotsky argued that children learn best when they are behaving within what he called their zone of proximal development. Now, he defined the zone of proximal development as that set of activities that a child is able to do when they are collaborating with a more skilled other person who can do this thing, but is not able to do by themselves or with somebody who's at the same level that they are. Vygotsky's view was that this is the primary way that children develop skills throughout history, throughout the world, is by interacting with others who are more advanced than them and collaborating. And this is what he calls playing within the zone of proximal development. So in this example that I just gave, the 4-year-old is in the zone of proximal development. The 4-year-old can play catch as long as he's playing catch with a kid who's somewhat older and more skilled at catch than he or she is. Now, other psychologists more recently have used the term scaffolding kind of as a metaphor to describe what the older child is doing in helping the younger child behave at this higher level. So we could say that the 8-year-old in this game of catch is scaffolding the behavior of the 4-year-old by tossing gently into the 4-year-old's hands, by leaping and catching the wild throw of the 4-year-old. So we've got this term zone of proximal development, if you want to have fancy term for it, and the term scaffolding to describe what's going on here when an older child is making it possible for a younger child to do something that the younger child wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So we saw lots of examples of scaffolding in our research at the Sudbury Valley School. And it can even be argued that scaffolding is the main root of education at that school. We saw it all the time, almost in any age mixed interaction, there's scaffolding going on. The older child, not because they're deliberately trying to educate in some broad sense the younger child, but just because to play together, to do something together, you need to bring the younger child up to the level in some ways that you're at in order to be able to do this thing. So it wasn't just in physical activities. We saw it a lot in physical activity, but also in intellectual activities. So for example, to take a quite different example from a game of catch, we saw children playing card games and board games where there were older and younger children playing together. Now, typically, if you had just a group of, let's say, 7-year-olds, even 7-year-olds, you're not going to see a lot of card games being played. Some 7-year-olds can organize a card game and keep it going, but the typical 7-year-olds can't. Their interest flags, it's not that they're cognitively incapable of understanding the rules or doing it, but they have difficulty keeping focused on it. They get distracted. The game kind of falls apart. But what we observed is if you've got, say, maybe some 7-year-old, couple 7-year-olds, and then you've got a 9 and a 10 and maybe an 11-year-old all playing the game together, it works out. And the reason is because the older kids are reminding the younger kids of what they have to do. Hold your cards, you're showing your cards, or don't you remember that card was already played? You can't play that card now. And they might not always be polite about it. They might add the word, "Hey, stupid, hold your cards." In some ways, this is not what you as a teacher are likely to say, I hope. But when kids say it, it's okay. It kind of makes it all the more genuine. The little kids, in some sense, don't mind being called that. They're used to it. But the older kids, so the point I'm making is the older kids are not doing this in order to be condescending are nice to the younger kids or to be pedantic to them. They're doing it because they want to get the game go, keep the game going. They do like the younger kids, so I have to say, otherwise they wouldn't be allowing them into the game. So we saw this. So what's happening here? The older kids are scaffolding intelligence, you could say. I mean, what is intelligence? It's the ability to keep yourself focused on what you're doing, the ability to remember the things that you have to remember in order to do what you're doing, the ability to pay attention. And the older kids are reminding the younger kids to do this as they're playing the game together. And in my observation, it's so much more effective when an older child does this than when an adult does it, for reasons that I may talk about as I'm going along here. We've even seen the scaffolding of reading and writing and arithmetic at this school. And I can give some examples of other contexts where this has occurred. So, for example, when children are playing a game that involves reading words, and you've got some children who know how to read and other children who don't know how to read, it's very common, especially in this day of video games where there's words on the screen and the kids are playing this game together, and the older children are pointing out that word to the younger children and say, remember, this word is stop, or this word is, whatever the word is, they're telling that, and they're teaching a certain amount of sight vocabulary. I've even observed kids say, that they're sound it out. There's sounds here, and kind of teach a little bit of phonics as they're showing the other kids, the kids who can't read, how to read this word on the computer screen as they're playing the game. There are other games also. We've also observed at the school that older kids who know how to read love to read to little kids. They love to read to little kids, and sometimes they point out the words as they're reading. So these are some of the ways that kids are learning how to read at a school like this. They would not happen if you only had kids, little kids who don't know how to read. Nobody's going to learn how to read from other kids. There, in that case, you've got to deliberately teach reading as a lesson. But in this school, kids are naturally learning how to read, and they're learning how to write, or at least type, because nobody writes anymore. At least type through playing these games, largely computer games. They're also learning scoring. They're learning about numbers. They're playing games, even a simple game like Candyland, you're getting the idea of numbers, you're getting the idea of addition. You move a certain number of spaces compared to whatever the dice or the dial shows you're supposed to move. Kids begin to play games that involve adding up numbers to get scores or subtracting numbers to know where you're at, sometimes even calculating averages. So kids are playing, and sometimes when they're playing together, this is not so much play, but in the school has a kitchen, and the kids are learning how to cook and follow recipes, and older kids are showing the younger kids what half a cup is. They're getting a sense of what a fraction and what fractions are in a very real way that people remember. There's even been not recently, but 20 or more years ago, were studies of age mixed classrooms, typical school classrooms. There was a phase 20 and more years ago of public schools deliberately having several grades in the same classroom, at least two or three grades in the same classroom. And there's a study, one of the studies I refer to in the references is by Christie and Stone. And what these people did is they took careful data on classroom behavior in a kindergarten over 2 years. And the interesting thing about this is the first year of this data collection, the kindergarten was age mixed. So there was not just kindergarten kids there, there was also first grade and second grade kids there. And this next year, that school had done away with the age mixing, sadly, in my opinion. And now it was just kindergarten in that same teacher, same play equipment, same time in history at a time when kindergarten was still largely a place to play. So kids were spending a lot of time playing. And what was observed in this study is that when there were first and second graders mixed with the kindergartners, There was a lot of reading and writing and use of numbers in the play because certainly the second graders knew how to read and they knew something about numbers. And so in the play, deliberately in this playroom, there were little books, there were in the pretend kitchen area, there were recipes, there were places where you could have a pretend birthday party and write birthday cards and all of these kinds of things. And what happened is that the kids were playing age mix. They didn't self-segregate so that only second graders were playing with second graders and so on. And the result is that the little kids were involved in writing birthday cards and in reading recipes and in reading bedtime stories to baby dolls in the context of their play. And they were actually learning some reading and writing and numbers as a result of interacting with the first and second graders in the play. The next year, without that, there was much less of that. Not surprisingly, when nobody knows how to read, you're not going to have reading as part of the pretend activities that are going on. So that's a similar kind of study is that yeah, again in the references Emphager. This was a study in a summer enrichment program in which there were children there between the age of 4 and 10, not segregated by age, so they could all play and interact together. And what was observed in this study is that very often the children played in an age mixed way in which it was very clear that the younger children were learning um, arithmetic skills from the older children. So just for example, there was one scene described in that article in which an older child was explaining to a much younger child how to give exactly 7 drops of medicine from an eyedropper to a sick baby doll. Exactly 7 drops. Kept emphasizing 7 drops. You have to count to 7 and showing how to do it. So this is a realistic context for a 4-year-old to really learn exactly what is 7 and why is it important to know 7. It can't be more than 7 drops or less than 7 drops of this medicine. And another scene in which the children were pretending that they were running a store, and the customers, children as customers, would come in and buy something, and the older children would explain what the cost was. And so the person running the cash register would have to know how to, if somebody bought something that cost $10 and something else that cost $5, how much do they have to pay? And if all they have is a $20 bill, how much change do they get? And the older children would explain to the younger children how to do this. Again, adults are around here, but they're not doing this. It's the children themselves who are doing this in the context of their play. So another example of scaffolding that might be quite relevant to those of you who have primarily much younger children in your group is the scaffolding of social play in 2-year-olds. So, it's well documented that 2-year-olds most often are not capable of truly social play with other 2-year-olds. They engage in what researchers call parallel play. They're playing and their play influences one another. They might both be playing with blocks or they might both be playing with dolls and they might be kind of mimicking one another, but they're not actually socially interacting. They're not integrating their play with one another. And so it's not true social play. So what some researchers have pointed out is that this kind of parallel play doesn't occur with 2-year-olds when there's older kids around, because the older kids draw them into truly social play and scaffold them into social play. So here's one experiment. Again, this is a study by Howes and Farber, which is also in the reference section if you're interested in looking it up. So they did an experiment in a daycare center where there were children between the age of 2 and 5 years old. And what they did is actually there's probably several daycare centers because they had a number of such pairings. What they did is they did this experiment where they would pair two children together and give them an interesting new toy and tell them to play together with it. So these two children be separated off from the rest of the group. And there was always children who knew one another because they were in the same daycare center. And so they had three different kinds of pairings. Sometimes it was just two 2-year-olds with one another. Sometimes it was two 5-year-olds with one another. And in the interesting case, a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old paired together. Now, what they found, no surprise, when the 5-year-olds were playing, they played in a much more sophisticated, truly social way with the toy than did just two 2-year-olds. No surprise there. But now the interesting thing, what happened when a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old was playing together? What they observed was that the 5-year-old continued to play at the same high level that a 5-year-old would have been playing if that person was with another 5-year-old. They didn't condescend, they didn't go down to a lower level of playing. But what they did is they drew the 2-year-old into their level of play. They scaffolded the play. They instructed the 2-year-old about what the 2-year-old can do. They gave hints. They allowed the 2-year-old the kinds of information and boosts that allowed the 2-year-old now to play essentially at a 5-year-old's level. And this is similar to what we've observed very frequently, regardless of whether it's regardless of age. So it turns out that 2-year-olds are capable of social play if they are playing with an older child, but they're not capable of it if they're just playing. They're not capable of fully social play if they're just playing with another 2-year-old. So you can see right off the great advantage there is in having 5-year-olds in with your 2-year-olds. The 2-year-olds are gonna have a far richer play experience than if they're just with other 2-year-olds. So age mixing, so I've been talking really about the zone of proximal development. Social play is within the zone of proximal development for a 2-year-old. Just like playing catch is in the zone of proximal development with a 4-year-old. But I've been talking about that, but it turns out that even when children are not actually playing together, there's an advantage in having children of different ages. And that advantage is that children are always interested in what older children are doing. Even when they're not playing with the older children, they're watching, they're listening. Every child kind of wants to emulate older children. Older children are better models really for kids than adults are. So just for example, for a 5-year-old, the fact that adults can read books, no big deal. Adults are a whole different category of animal. They can do all kinds of things that 5-year-olds can't do. But if those cool 7 and 8-year-olds are reading books or reading comic books and laughing and having fun reading comic books, that makes me as a 5-year-old think, wow, I I could do that too. I probably could do that. They're not that different from me, and that motivates me to want to learn how to read. We actually did a study. Some of my undergraduate students did a study at the Sudbury Valley School of learning to read at the school, where they interviewed children and they interviewed the staff members and parents about each child who learned to read. How did this child learn to read? And one of the interesting things we found out from the kids themselves, to the degree that they remembered their learning experience, is some of them remembered that what got me interested in reading is seeing these other kids reading. And as one child said, and this is a quotation, I wanted to join that club. I wanted to join that club of kids who could read. So again, if you just had kids who can't read, if you just had little kids, there would be no club that you would want to join. There would be no group of people that are showing how wonderful it is to be able to read, what fun it is. And thank goodness they were reading comic books and having fun reading comic books, which is far more motivating than reading a typical first grade primer. So that's the so again, that's an advantage of model. I'll give you another example. We saw all kinds of examples of it, but here's one example that I'll just actually read to you because this is something that I actually watched on the school playground one time when I was visiting the school and making observations. And what I would do when I would visit the schools, I would be pretending to read a magazine or a book, but really I'd be so they weren't aware. I mean, they kind of knew that they knew I was there to do research, but at any given moment, I wasn't obviously paying attention to them, but I was paying attention. And so here's one time I was sitting on the school playground. Now, this school, unlike most schools today, still has those really tall slides, the really tall slides that we now think are so dangerous that we don't allow them in schools anymore. This school still has them, and they don't prevent anybody from using them. The youngest kids are allowed to use the slide, and nobody's telling them how to use the slide. You can use it in whatever way you want. This is a school that still believes that that it's valuable for kids to play in somewhat risky ways, that that's how kids develop courage and physical abilities and so on and so forth. So here, I'll just read this little vignette that I wrote down after watching this particular scene. So as I sat near the school's playground, I watched two 10-year-old girls easily and nonchalantly perform the trick of walking upright down the slide, which, by the way, is harder than walking up the slide. A 6-year-old girl nearby watched them more intently than I, and then she climbed the ladder and started walking with knees bent and hands down, ready to grab the rails if she lost balance. I also noticed that the two older girls remained next to the slide and looked on with a degree of apprehension, ready to catch her, but not too obviously so, if she should fall. One said, "You don't have to do it, you can just slide." But the little girl continued walking slowly and beamed with pride when she made it to the bottom. Shortly after that, the two older girls began climbing a nearby tree, and the younger girl followed them in that activity too. So here's the case where a 6-year-old, has these two 10-year-old Hurons who she wants to emulate, and she's doing whatever those 10-year-olds are doing. But notice that the 10-year-olds are also kind of playing a caring role. They're kind of discouraging her from doing it, but when this little girl still wants to do it, they're there to catch her if she should fall. One of the advantage of having older children there is the older children actually quite naturally, and I've seen this in so many contacts, quite naturally look out for and care for the younger children. They provide a measure of safety for the younger children. And that's one of the advantages to the younger children is that they are kind of cared for. It's an advantage to the adults involved because the adults involved don't have to then be every place at once because older children are looking out for the younger children. So the third characteristic is that, which I've just described really, is the third advantage for younger children is that the older children provide an additional source of care and emotional support for the younger children. So sometimes people think that older children are going to bully younger children. But the research, not just my research, but other research too, shows just the opposite. Older children become more caring and more nurturing when younger children are around. And so one of the advantages of having age mixed interactions is that you, as the adult there, have help from the older children, even from a 5-year-old who's helping a 2-year-old. You have help from older children in caring for, comforting, providing to the younger children what the younger children might need. I recently came across an article that was based on a survey of childminders in Ireland. So childminders are people who I guess are very much like many of you who take care of other people's children in their homes And this survey was interested in whether childminders in Ireland like to have older children as well as younger children among the children that they're minding. So quite often, at least, on non-school days or after school or during the summer, these childminders are caring not just for infants and toddlers and preschoolers, but also for school-age kids. And the question was, do they like having the school-age kids there or not? Do they like having older kids or not? And overwhelmingly, they said they like it. And they said and they said for two reasons. One, it brings more joy to everybody. The older kids are bringing joy to the younger kids, and the older kids are really enjoying the younger kids. Everybody's having more fun, they say, when there's older kids as well as younger kids there. And also because the older kids are helping to take care of the younger ones. Not that they're assigned to do it, not that they have any obligation to do it, but they just naturally do it. Here's a couple of quotations that I wrote down from that article. So here's one of the childminders said, so they're holding hands at the playground, they're looking after each other, they're pushing one another in the swing, they just play. It works really well. And then another said, not unlike cousins within an extended Irish family who are connected through family network within a community, the children develop close relationships with each other, with deep bonds of mutual affection between older and younger children, despite occasional personality clashes. So it makes it a little bit more like a real family, that you've got kids of different ages interacting, and they bond with one another. They care about one another. We also observed at Sudbury Valley that sometimes really close, caring relationships, real friendships would develop between an older and a younger child, where it was almost as if the older child kind of adopted the younger child, as if this younger child is my child, and would be really proud of the accomplishments of the younger child, would show the younger child around, kind of brag about what the younger child could do. I think at a certain age, and this especially is true once they become adolescents, children are, and this is from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, are motivated to practice being parents. They aren't obviously doing this, but they're kind of practicing for parenthood. And so quite often it's this sort of adoption of a much younger child, and as if this is your own child, and behaving as if this is your own child, whether it's an infant or a toddler, is beneficial to everybody involved. So now I want to turn to I see I'm almost out of time. So I'm going to have to be very quick in the last. I'm going to be very quick about how age mixing benefits the older children in the interaction. Yeah, and I can be quick because this is kind of the other side of the coin of what I've just been talking about. It allows the older children to exercise their capacities to nurture, to teach, to learn. There's to lead. There's a lot of evidence that older children are actually nicer when there are younger children around. Nicer not just to the younger children, but even to one another. It's as if the younger children, especially infants, bring out the nurturing instincts in older children. It makes them feel this caring aspect comes out, and they're more caring even to one another. There's very little, almost no bullying at the Sudbury Valley School. And my belief is that one of the main reasons for that is because there's little kids around, and that brings out the caring aspect. A few years ago, we started age mixed play in elementary schools that involved play of all the children in the school, kindergarten through fifth grade combined. And some people were worried, some of the parents were worried, some of the teachers were worried that in this age mixed play, where they're not segregated by age, that the older children would bully the younger children. And I assured them this will not happen. And it hasn't happened. And that's been confirmed by all the teachers, by the parents who've observed it, the children themselves. And in fact, there's almost no bullying in that situation, unlike the situation in age-segregated recesses, where there's a lot of concern about bullying. And we've heard over and over again that age mixing is somehow reducing bullying. And I think part of it is because the younger children bring out the caring instincts in the older children. Older children in this context are also always explaining things to younger children. And when you explain things to younger children, you begin to understand them better yourself. Anybody who's taught knows that you actually learn more from teaching than you learn from being taught. Because when you're teaching, you have to get it so clear in your own mind that you can explain it to somebody else. And so in an age mix context, the older children just in the context of play are always explaining things to younger children. And the younger children may be asking them questions about it, which makes the older child think about, well, do I really understand this? And so you have this kind of back and forth discussion, which leads older children to, even though they may have had some understanding of the issue that they're trying to explain, they now gain a deeper understanding of it as they try to explain it to the other person and have to think it through so that the other person can understand it. I can just pass through D very quickly on the handout that enhance creativity and playfulness in age mixed play. When children are playing only with other children of the same age, sometimes in our culture, especially where we're so competitive, we're such a competitive culture and we're often putting children in competitions, the tendency is for the children to play in a competitive way. And that can kind of spoil play in a way where your only concern is winning, beating the other person. But when it's age mixed, it becomes not competitive anymore. I mean, what if you're 8 years old, you're playing whatever it is you're playing with a 4-year-old, what's the point in competing? Of course you would beat them if you were just competing. And the 4-year-old has no hope. So you've got to figure out some way of playing that's fun for everybody. And that would be a non-competitive way of playing. And it's often a more creative way of playing. You've got to change the rules. You've got to figure out a way for everybody to have fun. So the play becomes more nurturing, more educative in a sense, more creative, more playful. And also the other thing that's happened in these age mixed play groups that we've developed in typical elementary schools is that what the teachers observe when the children are playing this way is that the kids are much more tolerant of kids who are in some way different from the norm. So kids who are neurologically different in some way, and might be kind of excluded from the play group when everybody's the same age, might be kind of stigmatized in some way. When it's age mix, they turn out not to be so stigmatized, partly because they're playing with either older or younger kids, but also partly because when everybody's different, you've got little kids and big kids. The kid who's neurally different, has this neural difference, is not so different from other people. And there's a kind of a greater sense of let's play in a way that all of us can play together regardless of our differences. So I'll bring it to an end there. So we've got at least a little bit of time for questions and discussion. But thank you for your kind attention to what I've been talking about so far.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. I'm getting emotional. I see some reactions. We just have a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Gray that they would like to ask either through chat or unmuting? Walker, I see you have your hand raised.
Uh, Hi, Dr. Gray. It was very interesting listening what you were saying and also sending me back in the past when I was a kid. I was trying to remember all these memories with my friends and little kids and also my idols who were older than me, they do cool stuff and then I try to imitate them. But my question about what is happening now in these days is who's responsible for those changes? I was writing about, you know, new parenting ways, safety outdoors is not similar that it used to be. Technology is another thing, and then trusting in neighbors and people and adults outside, and parents are also constantly worried about their own kid. It's like it's a little bubble that we create around them, and don't touch, don't play, don't be. And kids, I've been working with kids for more than 10 years now, and then I can understand that it's a long way to learn from them, not from me, from them. We can learn all the things that you said is true. I can see that version of the lessons that I learned from them. And I can see that, unfortunately, parents are not like I don't know if they don't dedicate time to do that, to observe all these capacities that our kids have, and then enjoy and let them do those things that we grew up doing. And I was just wondering who's responsible for those changes. Thank you.
Yes, what you're describing is something that I often talk about and have done a lot of writing about. We have, unfortunately, we've made, the culture has evolved in such a way that we don't trust to just send kids out to play, even in places that are every bit as safe as they ever were, even places that are safer than they were before. We don't send kids out to play. And so we're not so used to play in general, and we've developed what has happened over time, and I think this would be a whole different talk about the forces that have created this. But we've created the expectation that adults are always supposed to be involved with children. The parents are supposed to be involved with children. They're supposed to be immediately involved with children, always watching their children, always, and teachers are supposed to always be involved with children. You don't just, when I was in elementary school, the teacher reset, we had, believe it or not, we had 2 full hours outdoors of recess during school time. Full hour at lunch, half hour in the middle of the morning, half hour in the middle of the afternoon. Teachers were not there. They took a break during that time. We played on our own. We were trusted to play. That doesn't happen anymore. It can't happen. It could happen. Children haven't changed, but we've changed our expectations of children. We've come to believe that things that are unsafe, that children are going to destroy one another, or that they're strangers out there. And so we've come to believe, I used to be a camp counselor back in the days when camp was a place for free play. I was waterfront director, and the kids could play whatever way they wanted. It wasn't like the purpose of camp was to learn some lessons from adults. The purpose of camp was to play. And some of the camp that I worked in was very age mixed. But this has changed. Sadly, this has changed for the worst. And I've written for people who are interested, you could find some of this writing on my webpage, just petergray.org. But I've published recently an article in the Journal of Pediatrics that makes the case that from multiple lines of evidence, that the reason we're seeing such high levels of anxiety, depression, even suicide among school-aged kids is because we've deprived them of the opportunity to grow up. We've deprived them of the opportunities to do things on their own, independently, which is necessary to learn that you can do things on your own. We've deprived them of the opportunity to play in risky ways, for example, which is how children develop courage. And when we so overprotect them, when we're guiding them and watching them every minute, then we're really, in some sense, preventing them from growing up emotionally and socially. And I think that's a problem. And this starts, I mean, when you're working with little kids, of course, you can't give them the same independence that you give to somewhat older kids, but you look at how much independence can I give them? How much even 2-year-olds want to do things themselves to the degree possible. So, a 2-year-old say, I do it myself when you're trying to help them do it. Because there's something in their DNA that tells them they've got to learn to take charge of their own lives already by 2 years old. And as they get older and older and older, it's more important, ever more important, that we give them the opportunity to take charge of their own lives. And one of the great things about about kids interacting and age mixed play, those kids that I said are kind of looking out for the younger kids. They are looking out for the younger kids, but they're actually doing it in a more reasonable way than adults in our world would. The adult would not have allowed that 6-year-old to walk down that slide at all. The 10-year-old girls knew that this 6-year-old could do it, but and that this was good for the 6-year-old. So even though they told her you don't have to do it, they let her do it. And at the same time, they provided a measure of safety. So in many ways, kids are better than we adults are today at minding children. Okay, again, thank you, Grace, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's great to the degree that I'm meeting you in this way. Great to have met you, and good luck with your work. Bye-bye.
Thank you.